I'm going to start out this lecture looking at some key concepts that emerge from the earlier Gospels that I was talking about last lecture. And then we're going to move a little bit along the chronological timeline into the very early Christian communities, particularly in Rome, and look at how certain concepts that will lead eventually to hospice start developing. It's good to start here with some etymology because there's actually, I'm finding shockingly little written on this part of hospice. Most people, when they're writing about hospice, focus on the more contemporary movement, which we will be looking at further on in the course. But a lot of the ideas that are coming from the earlier period, they're kind of scattered around. So I'm trying to bring them all together. So I just want to start with etymology, and this is typical of academia. It's good to start with looking at the word itself and the root of the word. So hospice, as I said earlier, tends to refer to an actual building or an institute rather than an idea, and so I do want to get at this. So hospice, as we can see here, Latin hospitum, and so you can immediately see that the word hospital comes from this as well. So these are linked concepts. So meaning a place to rest sometimes has the valence of a place for somebody who's ill or tired, or a host and a guest. And so related words coming from the Latin. Now we come across Latin all the time in the English language and in the Christian tradition, because there's the influence of the Greek and the Latin in the Christian tradition. So there's a lot of it throughout religious studies, certainly. So related words: hotel, hospital, hospitality. So if you start to think about, okay, what do these things have in common? The idea of a place where you're staying, but it's not your home, it's not your house, you're visiting it. And so it's interesting to see and to compare the secular attitude. Another word is hostel. So that's slightly downstream from hotel. If any of you have stayed in them, you'll know that. And but still, that idea, it's a place. Okay, it's not a concept, it's a place. And so some of you may know, when we think of secular ideas of hospitality, we think of, training to work in restaurants or to work in hotels. But actually, and there is, for any of you who have worked in hotels or restaurants, there still is this concept kind of hovering in the background that there's a kind of special set-aside nature. So when we talk about hospitality, we usually have a sense of generosity towards a stranger. So this is all sort of in that idea of hospice, coming out of a Christian tradition, but certainly there are many hospitality cultures throughout the world, as some of you will already know. And so the idea of the guest being sacred, and so if we look at Hinduism, there's a similar idea that you never know, the guest could be the god or goddess in disguise, so you always have to treat any guest with great respect. So we see all of these kind of nuances within the word hospice. The idea of a guest and treating them as though there's a kind of sacredness in the way that you're treating them, and pulling on again those ideas of the Good Samaritan, taking care of one's neighbor, and so on. Another very important organizing principle that starts to be enacted within the early Christian communities is that of caritas, which is also Latin, and it's often defined as love of God or altruistic love, and the English word charity is derived from this root. Now, charity's got a bit of a bad rap. I think of late it's seen as kind of condescending, but this certainly wasn't the original meaning. It's very much the idea of love in action, that love isn't just a thought that you have, it's taking action in the world. And the most famous definition is found in Corinthians, attributed to St. Paul, and some of you will know this. This is one of the most famous parts of the New Testament. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could move mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. Okay, so this is very famous. It's often read at Christian weddings. So this idea of you can have intelligence and intellect, and you can have even mystical gifts, and you can have all of these various gifts that are associated with being religious. But if you don't have this quality of caritas or charity, none of the other things matter. So this places, St. Paul places this right at the center. And so I do want to just stop for a moment here to talk about the word love, because in English we have this one word. So you could say, I love pizza, I love my cat, I love, I love traveling. It's a kind of a catch-all word, but within, particularly within Greek, there's many different types of love. Some of you may know this if you studied philosophy. So there's erotic love, there's agape, there's selfless love, there's all these types of love. So this isn't the greatest word, but it's the only one we've got in English. So that's why it's glossed with altruistic love. This isn't the idea of romantic love. This is a very different concept of giving to others, self-giving love. So it doesn't have to do with individual romantic attachment. So when we move into the 3rd century CE, and of course this is still very early days for the Christian community, there is a huge watershed moment which occurs, which is that the Roman Emperor Constantine takes up the Christian faith. So some of you will know that prior to this point, in the 4th century, Christians were actually being persecuted. They were often being thrown into the lion's den, being killed by animals at the Colosseum, and so on. And so there were many of them martyred in that earlier period. It's interesting to look at the historical record, because the Romans really, this often happens with new religious movements, they saw it as kind of a joke. It was something that their servants were practicing or their slaves were practicing, and so it was just a superstition for them. And but what we start to see is more and more of people, as I said in the earlier lecture, particularly from the lower classes, converting to this new religion. And so with Constantine, I don't want to get into the weeds with this, because there's a lot of controversy about, was he really sincerely Christian, or was he using it as a way to unite his kingdom? In a sense, it doesn't really matter for our purposes. With Constantine, the Roman Empire becomes Christianized, and we think that his mother had a great deal to do with this. She was a very devout Christian, and I'll be talking about her in a moment. And so the historical record states that he won a very important battle after which he became emperor, and he attributed it to the divine. And so he talks about seeing the sign of the cross in the sky, and which assured his victory. So this is an absolute watershed moment for the Christian tradition, because it becomes, I mean, it doesn't happen immediately, but very quickly it becomes the religion of empire, and so it moves all throughout what was the Roman Empire, and so it becomes eventually the religion of the state, and so institutions begin to develop. So we also see that Constantine became involved with church theology, and he tried to sort of solidify Christian theology, and that starts to happen. And so these ideas I've been talking about of caritas and so on start to be solidified within the tradition, partly as a result of Constantine. With the figure of Saint Helena, who was the Emperor Constantine's mother, we see again the importance of women in this early tradition, and this has been in many ways lost. And I teach on gender and religion And in all of the world's traditions, I find the same thing, that you really often have to go looking for the history of women in the traditions. And it's only been within about the last 40 years or so, with the second wave of feminism, that a lot of scholars have actually been writing about these things, finding records and bringing them forward. So we're starting to learn more about these figures now. Figures like Helena are saints within both the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches. So certainly people within those churches would probably know of her. But so as I said before, we find a lot of women in this early community, and there's many ideas of why this would be the case. We can speculate to some extent. Certainly it is true that new religious movements tend to attract women. We see this with Buddhism as well. And many scholars have speculated that this is probably because before traditions institutionalize, there's much more scope for women. And so we know that wealthy women were funding this early Christian movement. And so this continues on as the center of parts of the Christian tradition start moving to Rome, where it's still the Catholic Church is still, that's the center. So Helena, as the mother of the Roman emperor, has tremendous amount of influence. And so she, there's a lot of different legends around her, and trying to parse this out, what's true and what's legend, I can't attest to that with any degree of certainty. But what I do think is important is that she's also known as a very famous pilgrim who goes to Jerusalem. So she goes back to Jerusalem, the site to go on pilgrimage and see the sites where Jesus walked and so on. And so according to the record, she found what's been called the true cross. So she found the cross associated that Jesus was crucified upon. Again, I can't attest to the truth of this. So that's why in her iconography, you can see in this image, she's always shown holding the cross. And so in these kind of images, generally the figure is holding something that tells you who they are. So with Helena, she's holding the cross. And so she becomes very famous as a pilgrim, and we start to see these pilgrimages starting, including many women going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to Palestine. And this starts to become a very popular activity, and I'll be talking about that when we get to the medieval period, that those pilgrimage routes become very important in terms of the building of hospices, what are called hospices, and we'll get to that in due course. So another thing that's associated with Helena and with Constantine is the beginning of the creation of Christian buildings. Now, these would have been based on pre-existing Roman architecture, so things like the basilica. So these start to be built as churches and so on, and so the community is really starting to solidify as it becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. Now I'm going to be talking about Saint Fabiola, and she's so important that her statue that I'm showing you an image of here is actually in St. Peter's Square in Rome. And I would wager almost none of you have heard of her, but she was and is very important within the Catholic Church. And so what we see with Christians like Fabiola is Christianity starts to be also the religion of the upper classes, because it's now the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so Fabiola comes from a very different class, and so she's from the patrician, the aristocratic class of Rome. So she's wealthy, she's educated, and she lived a very typical life of a Roman matron. And so the word matron drawing on the same roots as mother. So a lot of the women are referred to as matrons, and that was a word often used for nurses in England up until very recently. So Fabiola came under the influence of one of the church fathers, Saint Jerome, who was an extremely ascetic mystic. And so eventually she gave up all of her worldly possessions and started giving them away. And she also built one of the first hospitals in Rome. So we see this direct connection between the women, so this is like 4th century CE, with the women and the development of these institutions like the hospice and the hospital. And from the very earliest days, the women often had the role we saw with the deaconesses of dealing with the body. And so even if we take it right back to the New Testament story of Mary Magdalene, it's Mary Magdalene that goes to retrieve the body of Jesus, and she's going to be applying the ointment and so on to the body. And so there's I have not read specifically that was the role of women, but it seems pretty clear that it was. And so dealing with the human body, of course, through being a mother, so there's is a direct correlation there. And so, so Fabiola takes that role, and she's often associated with the earliest forms of Christian nursing. And so, as I said, she gives her money and to those in need, and she starts building these institutions of healing. So Saint Marcela is another important woman of the 4th century in Rome, and again, she's a saint both in the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches. She's was again associated with Saint Jerome, so it was pretty clear that Saint Jerome had some kind of charisma going on. So he had a whole circle of followers, many of them women, and many of them were ascetics, and so that means doing without worldly goods, fasting, and these kind of practices. And I always find it interesting that people often evince surprise that women are involved in these kind of practices, but I have seen this across Buddhism, Hinduism. Women are often very avid renunciants and practicing things like fasting and doing without possessions. And this is a bit of an aside, but if you see the minimalists online, a lot of them are women. So I find that interesting. So Marcela, again, like Fabiola, came from a famous family in Rome, and again, under the influence of Saint Jerome, she starts giving away her worldly goods, and so she devoted her life to charity, to prayer, and to asceticism. And she began to collect a group of women around her, and so she herself became a kind of inspirational teacher to other women. And so we're told that her husband passed away 7 months after she was married. And so obviously within this ancient society, it was expected that a woman would marry. And so it was these first Christian women that start to question that as the only path for women. And eventually the idea of nuns starts to develop. And so with Saint Marcela, she refuses to remarry after the death of her husband. And so a lot of these very influential early women were not married or were widowed. And so they were able to kind of live these independent lives, which would have been very unusual. And we know that, like Fabiola, she was establishing what are referred to as hospices. Sometimes in the tradition, a lot of their teachings were going on in their own homes, or they would take pilgrims into their own homes. We also start to see the development of convents and monasteries, which also sometimes have hospices attached to them. And so slowly by the 4th century, these concepts and actual buildings are starting to come together and to develop into what will be called hospice.